At Christmas dinner, my ex-husband raised his glass, looked at my fiancé, and called him trash, and my own children laughed. I remember thinking, in that exact moment, that something inside me had finally gone quiet, not broken, not shattered, just settled into a kind of stillness I hadn't felt in years. The dining room looked exactly the way I had imagined it would when I spent the entire afternoon preparing it. The long oak table polished until it reflected the warm glow of the chandelier. The plates carefully set with my best china, the kind I used to save for special occasions back when family still meant something different. Outside, a thin layer of snow covered the yard, soft and undisturbed, like the world was holding its breath for Christmas. But inside, the air felt tight, stretched thin by smiles that didn't quite reach the eyes. Richard sat at the head of the table as if nothing had changed, as if the divorce 5 years ago had simply been a minor inconvenience instead of the moment everything quietly fell apart. His hand wrapped around a glass of red wine, swirling it slowly like he had all the time in the world. Across from him, Emily leaned back in her chair, scrolling through her phone between bites, while Jason laughed a little too loudly at something that hadn't been that funny to begin with. And beside me, Daniel sat calm, composed, his hands resting lightly in his lap, his expression unreadable in that steady, patient way that had first drawn me to him. "So," Richard said, setting his glass down with a soft click that somehow echoed louder than it should have, "this is the guy?" His eyes moved over Daniel, not quickly, not politely, but slowly, deliberately, like he was inspecting something he had already decided wasn't worth much. I felt the shift before the words even came, that subtle tightening in the room, like everyone knew what was about to happen and no one was going to stop it. "A janitor," he added, a small, amused smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, and then, without hesitation, without even lowering his voice, "He's trash." Emily let out a short laugh, covering it with her hand as if that made it better, while Jason didn't bother hiding his reaction at all, his chuckle filling the silence that followed. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I simply watched. Daniel turned his head slightly, just enough to meet Richard's gaze, and then he smiled. Not a defensive smile. Not an awkward one. Just calm. And that was when I realized something none of them seemed to notice. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't embarrassed. He wasn't even upset. He was waiting. I wrapped my fingers a little tighter around my glass, feeling the cool surface press against my skin, grounding me as the laughter faded and the conversation tried to stumble forward again like nothing had happened. For years, I had been the one smoothing things over, making excuses, pretending not to see what was right in front of me. For years, I had mistaken silence for peace. But this time felt different. This time, as I sat there at that beautifully set table, listening to my children laugh at the man I had chosen, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel ashamed. I felt certain. Because there was something about the way Daniel sat there, completely unbothered, completely steady, that told me one simple thing. They thought they understood what they were looking at. They were wrong. I picked up my fork and took a slow bite, even though I could not taste anything anymore. The flavors I had spent hours preparing reduced to nothing more than texture in my mouth as the conversation around the table resumed in that strange, artificial way people have when they pretend something uncomfortable never happened. Emily started talking about a trip she was planning with her friends, her voice light and careless, while Jason asked Richard about some business deal, his tone suddenly respectful again, like the moment from just seconds ago had already been filed away as harmless entertainment. No one looked at me. No one acknowledged what had been said, and no one, not a single one of them, thought they owed Daniel even the smallest apology. I set my fork down carefully, aligning it with the edge of my plate out of habit, a small, precise movement that gave my hands something to do while my mind worked through something far more important. For years, I had told myself that this was just how families were, that people said things they did not mean, that time and patience could smooth over even the sharpest edges. But sitting there now, watching, my children laugh easily with the man who had once walked away from us without a second thought, I realized that it had never been about misunderstanding. It had always been about choice. They had chosen who deserved their respect, and it had never been me. "So, Daniel," Richard said after a moment, his voice carrying that same casual superiority, "how long have you been cleaning floors?" He did not even try to hide it this time. the condescension laid out plainly in every word. I felt something in my chest tighten, not from embarrassment, not anymore, but from recognition. This was who he had always been. I just had not wanted to see it clearly before. Daniel did not answer right away. He reached for his glass of water, took a small sip, and set it back down with the same quiet control he had shown all evening. Then he leaned back slightly in his chair, his posture relaxed, his expression unchanged. Long enough, he said simply. That was it. No explanation. No defense. Just two words that seemed to land in the room with more weight than anything else that had been said so far. Richard let out a short laugh, shaking his head as if that response confirmed everything he believed. Well, he continued, glancing at Emily and Jason as if inviting them to share in the joke. I suppose everyone has to start somewhere. Emily smiled, but there was a flicker of something uncertain in her eyes this time. Something small and almost unnoticeable unless you were looking for it. Jason, on the other hand, leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. Mom, he said, finally addressing me directly. Are you serious about this? I mean, you could do a lot better. His words were not shouted. They were not even particularly harsh on the surface, but they carried a kind of quiet dismissal that cut deeper than anything Richard had said. I turned my head slowly to look at him, really look at him, noticing the lines around his eyes that had not been there a few years ago, the way he avoided holding my gaze for more than a second at a time. This was my son, the same boy I had once stayed up all night with when he had a fever, the same child whose hand I had held on his first day of school. And now he was sitting across from me, measuring my worth based on the man beside me. Better. I repeated softly, the word feeling strange as it left my mouth. Jason shrugged, as if the answer was obvious. You know what I mean. I didn't know what he meant. He meant someone with a title that impressed people. Someone who fit neatly into the version of success they all understood. Someone who would make them look good by association. I glanced at Daniel again, at the calm way he sat there, completely unaffected by the judgment being passed around the table, and for the first time that evening, I felt something unexpected rise up inside me. Not doubt, not shame, but a quiet, steady confidence. Because there was something they were all missing, something so clear to me now that I almost wondered how I had ever ignored it before. Respect was not something you demanded. It was something you revealed. And Daniel had not said much, but in his silence, in his patience, in the way he carried himself without needing to prove anything to anyone in that room, he had already shown more of it than all of them combined. And still, he had not made his move. Not yet. But I could feel it coming. The same way you can feel a shift in the air before a storm, subtle, undeniable, and impossible to stop once it begins. I leaned back slightly in my chair, letting the silence stretch just a second longer than what felt comfortable, watching how quickly they all moved to fill it, how eager they were to return to something lighter, safer, something that did not require them to look too closely at what had just been revealed about themselves. Emily reached for the breadbasket, offering it around with a polite smile that felt rehearsed, while Jason picked up his phone again, glancing down at the screen as if something there mattered more than the people sitting inches away from him. Richard, on the other hand, seemed almost energized by the shift, like he had found his rhythm again, his fingers tapping lightly against his glass as he studied Daniel with renewed interest. You know, he said, his voice smooth, almost conversational. I always believe that a man's value shows in the kind of life he builds. The house he owns, the company he runs, the people who respect him. He paused just long enough to let the words settle, his gaze never leaving Daniel's face. It is not really about the job title, of course, he added, though the slight lift of his brow suggested otherwise. But it does say something, does it not? I felt the old version of myself stir for a moment, the one who would have rushed to soften the edges, to laugh it off, to redirect the conversation before it went too far. But that version of me felt distant now, like a memory from a life I no longer recognized. Instead, I stayed still, my hands folded loosely in my lap, my attention fixed not on Richard, but on Daniel. He had not moved much throughout the entire evening, not in the way people usually do when they are uncomfortable, shifting in their seats, forcing smiles, searching for ways to defend themselves. He had simply observed, measured, waited, and now, for the first time, I noticed something else. A small detail, easy to miss unless you were paying close attention. The server approached our table quietly, carrying a tray of refilled drinks, and as she set a glass down near Daniel, she gave a slight nod and said, "Of course, sir." It was subtle, almost nothing, but it was not the way she spoke to the rest of us. There was a difference in her tone, a quiet respect that did not match the picture Richard was trying so hard to paint. Daniel acknowledged her with a brief, polite glance, nothing more, and she moved on as if nothing unusual had happened. I saw it, and for a brief second, so did Emily. Her eyes flickered toward Daniel, then back to her plate, her smile tightening just a fraction. Jason missed it entirely. Richard, too focused on his own performance, did not seem to notice at all. Anyway, Richard continued, leaning back with a satisfied expression. "I suppose as long as you are happy, Margaret, that is what matters." The way he said my name felt like a reminder, not of who I was, but of the version of me he had always expected me to remain. Compliant, grateful, small. I let out a quiet breath, feeling something settle deeper into place inside me, something firm and unshakable. I said simply, and for the first time that evening, I meant it in a way they could not possibly understand. Daniel turned his head slightly toward me then, just enough for our eyes to meet, and there was a brief moment of shared understanding there, something unspoken but unmistakable. He knew that I had seen it, that I had finally put the pieces together, that whatever was about to happen next was no longer just his move to make. It was ours. The conversation drifted again after that, moving into safer territory, holiday plans, travel schedules, the kind of surface-level chatter that fills space without ever touching anything real. But underneath it all, something had shifted. I could feel it in the way the room seemed just a little quieter, in the way Emily avoided looking directly at Daniel now, in the way Richard's confidence had a faint, almost imperceptible crack running through it. They thought they were still in control of the narrative, still directing the scene, still deciding who belonged and who did not. But they had missed the moment when that control slipped. They had missed the small signs, the quiet details, the things that did not fit their assumptions. And as I sat there, listening to their voices blur into the background, I realized something with absolute clarity. The night was not unfolding the way they thought it was. Not even close. The clinking of silverware softened into the background as dessert was brought out, a neatly arranged tray of pies and small pastries that I had picked up earlier that afternoon, each one chosen carefully out of habit, out of a sense of duty that had long outlived the appreciation it once received. And as the plates were passed around, I noticed how easily everyone slipped into comfort again, how quickly tension could be buried under sugar and routine when people were determined not to look too closely at what had already cracked beneath the surface. Emily complimented the pecan pie, though she did not ask where it came from, and Jason poured himself another drink, his laughter returning in short bursts that sounded almost rehearsed, while Richard leaned back in his chair with that same quiet confidence, as if the evening had already confirmed everything he believed about the world and his place in it. I sat still, my hands resting lightly against the edge of the table, watching it all with a clarity that felt new, almost unfamiliar, like adjusting to a different kind of light after years of seeing everything through a softer lens. For so long, I had measured moments like this by how well I could hold them together, how smoothly I could move conversations away from discomfort, how quickly I could absorb tension before it spread. But tonight, I did not feel the need to fix anything. I did not feel the urge to make excuses or smooth over what had already been said. I simply observed. Daniel had not reached for dessert. He sat exactly as he had before, composed, his attention not fixed on any one person but on the room as a whole, as if he were taking everything in, every word, every glance, every small shift in tone that most people would miss. There was a quiet precision to him, something deliberate in the way he remained still while everything else moved around him. It reminded me of the first time we met, though at the time I had not fully understood what I was seeing. It had been a simple afternoon, nothing remarkable on the surface, a building lobby with polished floors and the faint scent of cleaning solution lingering in the air, and I had noticed him not because of what he was doing, but because of how he carried himself while doing it. There had been no rush in his movements, no trace of the invisibility that so often comes with work like that. He had acknowledged people when they passed, not with forced politeness, but with a kind of quiet assurance, as if he belonged in every space he stepped into. I had found that unusual then. I found it even more telling now. "You are awfully quiet over there," Richard said suddenly, his voice cutting gently through the room as he looked at Daniel again, tilting his head just slightly, as if studying something he could not quite figure out. "Most people would have something to say after all this." His tone was lighter this time, almost curious, but the edge was still there, tucked neatly beneath the surface. Daniel glanced at him, then at me, and for a brief moment, I saw that same faint smile return, the one that had unsettled Richard earlier without him even realizing it. "Sometimes," Daniel said, his voice even and unhurried, "it is better to listen first." That was all. Another simple answer. Another response that did not give them what they expected. Richard let out a soft chuckle, though it sounded less certain this time, like he was trying to maintain control of something that was slowly slipping out of reach. "And what exactly are you listening for?" he asked, leaning forward just slightly now, his interest sharpening. The room seemed to quiet again, not completely, but enough that the weight of the question settled between us. Daniel did not answer right away. He let the silence sit, just long enough to make it noticeable, just long enough for everyone at the table to become aware of it. Then he spoke, his voice calm, steady, and clear. "Patterns," he said. A single word, but it landed differently. I saw it in the way Emily's hand paused mid-motion as she reached for her glass, in the way Jason's gaze lifted from his phone, in the way Richard's expression shifted ever so slightly, a flicker of something that had not been there before. Confusion, uncertainty, maybe even the first hint of doubt. I felt it too, not as a question, but as confirmation. Because suddenly, everything made sense in a way it had not before. Every glance, every comment, every carefully placed word throughout the evening forming a pattern so clear it was impossible to ignore once you saw it. And the most important part was this. Daniel had seen it too, long before any of them realized they were being read. The word lingered in the air longer than it should have, as if it had weight, as if it had quietly settled over the table and pressed down just enough to make everyone aware of it without fully understanding why. And for a moment, no one spoke, not because they had nothing to say, but because they were trying to decide how to respond without losing the upper hand they believed they still had. Richard was the first to recover, of course, his fingers tapping lightly against the table again as he let out a soft, controlled laugh, the kind meant to dismiss without appearing threatened. "Patterns," he repeated, shaking his head slightly as if the idea amused him. "That sounds philosophical." He leaned back in his chair, crossing one leg over the other, reclaiming his posture of ease. "And what exactly do you think you are seeing here?" Daniel did not answer immediately. He did not rush to explain or justify himself, and that alone seemed to irritate Richard more than any argument could have. Instead, he reached for his glass again, taking another slow sip, his gaze drifting briefly across the table, not lingering on any one person, but noticing everything. I followed his eyes without turning my head, and for the first time, I saw it as clearly as he did. Emily's forced smile, Jason's restless movements, Richard's need to fill every silence with control. It was all there, laid out in small, almost invisible details that added up to something undeniable once you knew how to look. "I think," Daniel said finally, setting his glass down with quiet precision, "that people show you who they are long before they say it out loud." His voice remained calm, almost gentle, but there was something underneath it now, something firm that did not invite interruption. Richard's expression tightened just slightly, though he tried to mask it with another smile. "That is a convenient way to avoid answering a direct question," he replied, his tone sharpening just enough to signal that he was no longer entirely in control of the exchange. Jason shifted in his seat, glancing between the two men as if unsure which side of the conversation he was supposed to support, while Emily kept her eyes on her plate, her fork moving slowly, deliberately, though she was no longer eating. I felt a strange sense of clarity settle over me, like a lens had finally come into focus after years of distortion. For so long, I had believed that respect was something that could be rebuilt, that relationships could be repaired if you just tried hard enough, gave enough, stayed long enough. But sitting there now, watching the subtle discomfort begin to ripple through the table, I realized that some things had never been broken by accident. They had been shaped this way, over time, through choices that had nothing to do with misunderstanding and everything to do with how people truly saw you. Daniel turned his head slightly then, his gaze resting on Jason for a brief moment. For example, he continued, his tone unchanged. Someone who values appearances will always protect them first, even if it means dismissing something real. Jason opened his mouth as if to respond, then closed it again, his brow tightening in a way I had not seen before. The words had landed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but precisely. Daniel's attention shifted again, this time toward Emily. And someone who avoids discomfort will often pretend not to see what is right in front of them. Emily's hand stilled completely now, her fingers tightening around her fork, though she still did not look up. The room felt different. Not tense in the way it had been earlier, filled with sharp comments and easy laughter, but quieter, heavier, like something had been uncovered that could not be easily hidden again. Richard straightened slightly in his chair, his confidence no longer as effortless as it had been at the start of the evening. "Are you trying to make a point?" he asked, his voice measured, careful now. Daniel met his gaze directly this time, and for the first time since the dinner began, there was no hint of deflection, no softness in the way he held eye contact. "No," he said simply. "I am just describing what is already here." And in that moment, I realized something that changed everything. This was not a defense. It was not an explanation. It was a quiet exposure, and none of them were ready for what came next. The silence that followed did not feel accidental anymore. It felt chosen, as if everyone at the table understood on some level that stepping into it too quickly would only make things worse. And for the first time that evening, no one rushed to fill it. Richard's fingers stopped tapping. Jason did not reach for his phone. Even Emily, who had spent most of the night avoiding eye contact, slowly lifted her gaze. Her expression no longer carefully composed but uncertain, almost searching for something she could not quite name. I sat there without moving, feeling the shift settle into place, not dramatic, not loud, but undeniable. This was the moment where everything changed direction, not because of a raised voice or a harsh argument, but because the truth had been placed quietly on the table, and no one could pretend it was not there anymore. Richard cleared his throat, a small, controlled sound that seemed louder than it should have been in the stillness. "You are making quite a few assumptions," he said, his tone measured, though the ease from earlier had disappeared, replaced by something tighter, more deliberate. "You do not know anything about this family." Daniel did not react to the challenge in the way most people would. He did not defend himself. He did not lean forward or raise his voice. Instead, he remained exactly as he was, calm, steady, as if he had already anticipated this response long before the conversation reached this point. "You are right," he said simply. "I do not know everything." The acknowledgement seemed to catch Richard off guard for a second, just long enough to create a small crack in the rhythm he had been trying to maintain. Daniel continued before he could recover. "But I know enough." The words were quiet, but they carried a certainty that did not invite debate. Jason shifted again, this time more noticeably, his shoulders tightening as he looked down at the table, tracing the edge of his plate with his finger like he needed something to focus on that was not the conversation unfolding in front of him. Emily's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something, but no words came. I watched them both, really watched them, and for the first time, I did not feel the instinct to protect them from discomfort. I let them sit in it. I let them feel it. Because maybe this was the first honest moment we had shared in years. "Enough to what?" Richard asked, his voice sharper now, the control slipping just a fraction more with each passing second. Daniel met his gaze again, unwavering. "Enough to understand why she stayed quiet for so long," he said, and though he did not say my name, every word pointed directly at me. I felt something shift deep inside my chest, not pain, not regret, but recognition, like hearing something out loud that I had always known but never allowed myself to fully accept. Richard let out a short, dismissive laugh, though it sounded thinner now, less certain. "If you were trying to play some kind of hero here, you are a little late," he replied. "This is not your story." Daniel's expression did not change, but there was a subtle difference now, something firmer in the way he held himself, like a line had been quietly drawn. "You are right again," he said. "It is not my story." He paused, just briefly, just enough to let the next words land with intention. but it is my responsibility. That was when everything stilled completely. Not just the room, but the space between each person at the table, as if the meaning of what he had said had not fully settled yet, but was already beginning to take shape in ways they could not control. Responsibility. The word did not belong in the version of events they had been trying to maintain. It did not fit the narrative of someone they had already decided was insignificant. And yet, there it was, spoken without hesitation, without apology. I felt my breath slow, my thoughts sharpen, every detail around me coming into focus with a clarity that left no room for doubt. Daniel was not reacting. He was revealing. And the more he spoke, the more obvious it became that he had been doing it from the very beginning, piece by piece, moment by moment, allowing them to expose themselves without ever needing to raise his voice. Richard leaned forward slightly, his hands now resting flat against the table, the last traces of his earlier confidence slipping into something else entirely. "And what exactly do you think you are responsible for?" he asked, his tone no longer casual, no longer amused, but careful, almost cautious. Daniel did not hesitate this time. He did not look away. "For making sure she is never underestimated again," he said. And in that moment, I understood something with complete certainty. This was no longer about proving anyone wrong. It was about showing them, quietly and completely, exactly how wrong they had been all along. No one moved after that. Not immediately. As if the weight of Daniel's words had pressed everything into place and held it there, suspended in a kind of quiet that felt heavier than any argument could have been. I watched Richard closely, the way his jaw tightened just slightly, the way his fingers curled inward against the table before relaxing again, as though he were trying to decide whether to push back or pull away. For years, I had known his patterns too, the way he relied on confidence to carry him through any situation, the way he dismissed anything that threatened his sense of control. But this was different. This was not something he could brush aside with a laugh or redirect with a clever remark. This was something that had already taken root in the room, something that was no longer his to manage. "You are taking this a bit too seriously," he said finally, though the ease in his voice had thinned, replaced by something that felt more like an attempt than a truth. "It was just a joke." I felt the words land, familiar in a way that made them almost predictable, the same justification that had been used so many times before to soften things that were never meant to be soft. I used to accept that explanation. I used to tell myself that intention mattered more than impact. But sitting there now, I realized how often just a joke had been used to say exactly what someone meant without having to take responsibility for it. Daniel did not respond right away. He let the statement settle, just long enough for it to echo in the silence that followed. Then he turned his head slightly, his gaze moving not to Richard, but to Emily and Jason. "Do you believe that?" he asked, his voice calm, almost gentle, but steady in a way that made it impossible to ignore. The question did not sound like an accusation. It sounded like an invitation. Emily's eyes flickered toward Richard, then back to Daniel, uncertainty written clearly across her face now, no longer hidden behind polite smiles or distracted gestures. Jason shifted again, his posture tightening, as if he were caught between two versions of something he had not fully examined before. Neither of them answered. They did not need to. The silence spoke clearly enough. Richard let out a short breath, leaning back in his chair as if trying to create distance from the moment. "You are putting words in their mouths," he said, though there was less force behind it now, less certainty. "They know I did not mean anything by it." Daniel nodded once, a small, acknowledging motion that did not concede anything. "Intent does not erase impact," he said quietly. The words were simple, almost understated, but they landed with a kind of finality that shifted the room again, not abruptly, but steadily, like a slow turn that you only notice once everything is facing a different direction. I felt something settle deeper inside me, something that had been building all evening finally finding its place. For so long, I had been the one absorbing moments like this, carrying them quietly, telling myself they were not worth addressing. That peace was more important than honesty. But now, hearing it spoken so clearly, so simply, I realized how much had been left unspoken, how much had been allowed to continue simply because no one had ever named it out loud. Emily set her fork down, the small clink against her plate louder than it should have been, her gaze dropping to the table as if she were seeing it for the first time. Jason exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair, the easy confidence he had carried earlier now replaced by something more uncertain, more reflective. And Richard, for the first time that night, did not have an immediate response. He looked at Daniel, then at me, and something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, not enough for him to admit it, but enough for me to see it clearly. The balance had changed. Not completely, not yet, but enough that the version of the evening he had started with no longer held. I glanced at Daniel, at the calm way he remained exactly where he was, not pressing further, not forcing anything, simply allowing the truth to exist in the space he had created. And in that moment, I understood something that felt both simple and profound. This was not about winning an argument. It was about ending a pattern. And once it had been seen this clearly, there was no going back to pretending it was not there. The room did not return to normal after that, no matter how much time passed or how many small attempts were made to steer the conversation back to something lighter, because once something true has been said out loud, it does not disappear, it lingers, it settles into the space between people and quietly reshapes the way they see each other. Emily reached for her glass again, but her hand hesitated halfway, as if she had forgotten why she was reaching for it in the first place, while Jason leaned back in his chair, his usual ease replaced by a kind of restlessness that showed in the way his foot tapped lightly against the floor. Richard, however, tried one more time. He straightened his posture, adjusted his sleeve, as if resetting himself, and let out a measured breath. "Well," he said, forcing a small smile that did not quite hold, "this has certainly turned into something more dramatic than I expected." He glanced around the table, searching for agreement, for someone to help him re-establish the tone he had started the evening with. No one offered it. Not this time. I watched him carefully, not with anger, not even with disappointment, but with a clarity that felt almost detached. For years, I had seen him as someone who controlled the room, someone whose words shaped the way others responded, but now I saw something else. I saw how much of that control depended on people going along with it. And tonight, that quiet agreement had shifted. Daniel moved then, just slightly, adjusting his position in his chair, and the movement alone seemed to draw everyone's attention back to him, not because it was dramatic, but because it was deliberate. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, not hurried, not hesitant, just steady, and for a brief moment, I saw Richard's expression change again, that flicker of uncertainty returning, sharper this time. Daniel placed a small, simple card on the table, sliding it forward with 2 fingers until it rested near the center, within clear view of everyone. He did not announce it. He did not explain it. He simply let it sit there. Jason was the first to lean forward, his curiosity overriding his hesitation as he picked it up, turning it over in his hand. I watched his face as he read it, the way his expression shifted almost instantly, the casual confidence draining from it as something else took its place. Surprise, then confusion, then something closer to realization. "What is it?" Emily asked, her voice quieter now, less certain, as she leaned in slightly. Jason did not answer right away. He looked up at Daniel, then at me, then back at the card as if trying to reconcile what he was seeing with everything he had assumed just minutes ago. Finally, he passed it to Emily without a word. She took it carefully, her fingers tightening around the edges as her eyes moved across the surface, and I saw the same progression unfold on her face, the same quiet unraveling of certainty. Richard remained still, watching them both, his jaw set, his patience thinning. "Are you going to share with the rest of us?" he asked, his voice controlled but edged now with something sharper. Emily hesitated, then slowly placed the card on the table in front of him. He picked it up, his movements more deliberate than before, and for a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath again. I did not need to see the card to know what it said. I had seen it before, held it in my own hands, felt the same quiet shift it had created in me when I first understood what it meant. Richard's eyes moved across it, his expression tightening in a way he could not quite hide this time, the practiced confidence slipping just enough to reveal something underneath it. He looked up at Daniel, then back at the card, as if hoping he had misunderstood something. "This is," he began, but the words did not come as easily as they had before. Daniel did not interrupt him. He did not rush to fill the silence. He simply waited. And in that waiting, in that calm, unshaken presence, the truth settled fully into place, No longer hinted at, no longer suggested, but undeniable. I felt a quiet steadiness settle over me, something firm and unshakable, as I watched the shift complete itself, not with noise or confrontation, but with something far more powerful. Understanding. They had spent the entire evening deciding who Daniel was based on what they thought they saw. And now, with a single, simple gesture, that illusion had been quietly removed, and there was nothing left for them to hide behind. Richard did not speak for several seconds, and in all the years I had known him, I could not remember a single moment where silence had held him this completely, where words had not come quickly, easily, like they always had before. He stared at the card as if it might change if he looked at it long enough, as if the truth printed on it could somehow rearrange itself into something more convenient, something that fit the version of the world he preferred. But it did not. It remained exactly what it was. Simple, clear, unavoidable. Jason leaned forward again, his voice lower now, stripped of the earlier confidence that had filled it. "Is this real?" he asked, not to challenge, but to understand. Daniel did not react with offense or pride. He simply nodded once. "It is." That was all. No elaboration. No attempt to impress. Just confirmation. Emily looked between them, her expression unsettled in a way that felt genuine, no longer masked by politeness or distraction. "You own the building?" she asked slowly, the words coming out as if she was still trying to piece them together. Daniel met her gaze calmly. "Among other things," he said, his tone unchanged, steady, almost quiet. The understatement hung in the air, heavier than any boast could have been. Richard set the card down carefully, his movements controlled, but the tension in his hands betrayed him. "So you decided to what?" he said, searching for the right angle, the right way to regain control. "Play a part. Let everyone think you were something else." Daniel did not look offended. He did not look defensive. If anything, he looked patient. "I did not correct assumptions that were never asked with respect," he replied. The words landed cleanly, without force, but with a precision that left no room to twist them. I felt something shift inside me again, not because of the reveal itself, but because of what it confirmed. This had never been about proving his worth. It had been about revealing theirs. Jason leaned back slowly, exhaling as if something inside him had just settled in a way he could not ignore. "So all this time," he began, then stopped, shaking his head slightly. He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Emily's eyes moved to me then, really looking at me for the first time that evening, not through the lens of expectation or judgment, but with something closer to realization. "Mom," she said softly, but whatever she had been about to say faded before it fully formed. I held her gaze for a moment, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a calm I had not felt in years. There was nothing left to explain, nothing left to defend. The truth had already done that on its own. Richard straightened in his chair again, one last attempt to regain some version of himself that still felt intact. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "that is impressive." The words sounded forced, like it had been chosen because it was the only one available, not because it reflected what he truly felt. Daniel gave a small nod, acknowledging it without accepting it as anything meaningful. The room was quiet again, but this time it was different. Not heavy with tension, not filled with unspoken conflict, but clear, like everything unnecessary had been stripped away. I looked around the table, at the faces I had spent years trying to hold together, trying to protect, trying to understand, and for the first time, I saw them without the weight of expectation. They were not villains. They were not enemies. They were simply people who had shown me exactly who they were. And now, finally, I believed them. I placed my hands gently against the edge of the table and stood up, the movement calm, unhurried, but intentional enough to draw their attention. No one tried to stop me. No one spoke. Daniel stood beside me a moment later, his presence steady, familiar, without the need for words. I reached for his hand, and he took mine without hesitation, his grip warm, certain. I did not look back at Richard. I did not wait for Emily or Jason to say anything they were not ready to understand. Some moments do not need closure spoken out loud. They close on their own. As we walked toward the door, I felt something I had not felt in a long time. Not relief. Not victory. Something quieter. Something stronger. Freedom. And as the door opened and the cold night air met us, I realized one final truth, simple and undeniable. I had not lost my family tonight. They had lost me.